"My son needs a doctor, not a musician," David Thorne said coldly, his voice dripping with contempt. As a man who measured everything by its monetary value, David couldn't tolerate the presence of the impoverished teacher in his worn-out sweater. What he didn't know was that the very musician he disdained held his son's last hope. A lesson in sacrifice and invaluable virtues would soon teach David a bitter truth. Some things can never be bought with money. The VIP room, 702 at Street, Jude International Hospital, was more expensive per night than a luxury vacation in Bali. It was designed not for healing, but to conceal the raw truth of illness behind a flawless facade of wealth. The Swedish oak floorboards didn't creak. Abstract art worth tens of thousands of dollars hung on the walls, and a massive floor-to-ceiling panoramic window displayed the city's sparkling lights like a shimmering diamond carpet. Everything was clean, luxurious, and sterile. But that very perfection created a cold, distant atmosphere, as if life itself dared not linger here. On the state-of-the-art Hillrom medical bed, 10-year-old Liam Thorne no longer lived. He merely existed. The boy was now like a fragile porcelain doll, ready to shatter at any moment. His once rosy skin, a testament to countless hours on the soccer field, was now pale and translucent, so much so that the blue veins showed through like a delicate spiderweb. His lips were chapped, and his faint breaths were only enough to make his small chest barely rise and fall under his silk pajamas. End-stage bone marrow failure. Those 3 words, spoken by the leading specialist 6 months ago, now hung over him and his tormented father like a death sentence. David Thorne entered the room, his usual powerful strides replaced by an unfamiliar tiptoe. He was afraid of disturbing the fragile stillness, afraid of waking his son from his rare sleep. Just back from a 14-hour flight from Japan, his once perfect Tom Ford suit was wrinkled, his silk tie loosely undone. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, a testament to the long, sleepless nights that no expensive cream could conceal. He placed an intricate lacquer box on the marble table. Inside were several vials of an amber liquid, which he had acquired through a tense negotiation and a sum of money that could buy an entire penthouse apartment. "This is the best medicine from Japan," he whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The doctor said it might work. It's our last hope, son." He tried to infuse his voice with optimism, but even he didn't believe it. Liam stirred slightly, his heavy, vacant eyes opening. He looked at the wooden box, then back at his father. In his gaze, there was no excitement, no glimmer of hope, only an endless weariness, a seasoned resignation far beyond his years. "Dad," his voice was weak, dry like the rustle of autumn leaves. "I'm tired. I just want to sleep." David's heart felt as if an invisible hand was squeezing it. He was used to solving every problem by writing checks, giving orders, and buying out competitors. But his son's illness mocked his wealth and ignored his power. Helplessness gnawed at the soul of a man accustomed to controlling everything. He looked at his son, the child who once chattered about the stars and was full of laughter, now just a faint shadow, fading right before his eyes. The following days passed in a suffocating silence and monotony. Every morning, a nurse would come in to change his IV fluids. Every afternoon, an elaborate meal would be brought by a private chef, but Liam would only look at it and shake his head. Every evening, David would sit by the bed, reading stories about explorers, but Liam's eyes remained empty, gazing at a distant place David could not reach. To break the deadlock, the head nurse, a middle-aged Irish woman named Mary with warm eyes and an understanding smile, made a suggestion. "Mr. Thorne, downstairs, there's a common room for pediatric patients. Sometimes volunteers come to play music and tell stories. Maybe a change of scenery would be good for the boy. It's too quiet here." David initially planned to refuse. He didn't like the idea of his son, a thorn, mixing with other patients. But then he looked at Liam's pale face and the deathly silence in the room. He reluctantly nodded. The common room was a completely different world. The walls were painted bright colors, covered with children's scribbles. The atmosphere was noisy, lively with laughter, toys scattered everywhere, and an old oak piano sitting quietly in the corner. Liam, in his wheelchair, felt out of place. He was an outsider, a spectator in a cheerful play he didn't belong to. As Liam was listlessly looking out the window, a familiar melody suddenly rang out, shattering the silence in his world. It wasn't a complex symphony or a grand classical piece. The tune was just the simple children's song, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, with a gentle jazz twist. Clear and warm, it flowed into the boy's parched soul like a refreshing stream. The melody awakened a distant memory of his mother sitting at the piano, her long hair loose, and a gentle smile on her face, playing for him before bedtime. Liam raised his head, his eyes searching for the source of the music. Sitting at the old piano was a middle-aged man with short, neat salt and pepper hair. He wore a well-worn beige sweater and simple khaki pants. His face was etched with the deep lines of time, but his eyes were unusually bright and kind. He closed his eyes, swaying slightly to the music, his fingers seeming to have a life of their own, dancing skillfully across the yellowed keys. It was Mr. Daniel Peterson, Liam's music teacher from his old elementary school. Liam hadn't seen him since he had to quit school to be hospitalized almost a year ago. He didn't expect to see him here, in these circumstances. When the last note rang out and faded into the air, Mr. Daniel opened his eyes, as if returning from another world. He met Liam's gaze. A warm smile, without a hint of surprise, spread across his lips. "Hello, Liam. Long time no see." His voice was low and gentle. "Would you like to try again? I believe your fingers still remember." Not a single question about the IV tubes or the pale skin. Not a single look of pity, just music and a sincere invitation, as if they had just seen each other in class yesterday and he had only missed one lesson. A strange feeling, long dormant, welled up inside Liam. It was excitement. He gave a small, weak but determined nod. Mr. Daniel stood up, making room for him. With the help of Nurse Mary, Liam moved from the wheelchair to the piano bench. His fingers were thin and weak. He hesitated before placing his hands on the keys. Cold. He had forgotten this feeling. "Don't be afraid," Mr. Daniel said, standing beside him, his voice reassuring. "Just let your heart lead the way. Start with the C note, right here." Liam did as he was told. A note sounded, hesitant and shaky, but it was a sound he had created himself. He tried again, this time with a little more confidence. Gradually, a simple sequence of notes began to form. A smile, the first real smile in months, appeared on the boy's face. David arrived to visit his son and froze at the sight. His son was playing the piano. His son was smiling. A sense of relief crept into his heart, but right after, another feeling, more unpleasant and sharp, arose. It was wounded pride. He had spent millions of dollars on psychologists and expensive recreational therapies that yielded no results, yet this man, in a worn sweater, had done it with just a rickety piano. He walked over, his shiny Salvatore Ferragamo leather shoes clicking on the floor, shattering the warm atmosphere. "Mr. Daniel, I appreciate your effort." His voice was cold and distant, emphasizing each word. "But my son needs a doctor. He needs the best treatments, not these amusements." "Mr." Daniel turned around, his gaze calm, unfazed by David's attitude. "Mr. Thorne, medicine heals the body, but music heals the soul. In this fight, the boy needs both." "The soul," David scoffed, a look of contempt on his face. "I need a miracle to save my son, not a poor musician." He took Liam's hand, pulling him away from the piano. Liam looked at his teacher with a look of regret and a bit of shame for his father. "Mr." Daniel just gave him a slight nod, a silent reassurance that everything was okay. That night, in the luxurious hospital room, after the nurse had left, Liam looked at his father, and tears began to stream down his hollow cheeks. "Dad," he whimpered. "I don't need medicine anymore. I don't want to go anywhere either. I just wish I could play one complete song for you before I go." The boy's words were like an invisible hammer, striking a blow to David's fortress of pride. He was speechless. Every argument, every plan, every number in his head vanished. He sat there, by his son's bed, feeling the utter powerlessness of money for the first time in his life. He could buy the world, but he couldn't buy his son a little more time to fulfill a heartbreakingly simple wish. David's contempt did not faze Daniel. He had lived long enough to understand that fear could turn even the kindest people into prickly individuals. He came to the hospital, not for David, but for Liam. Every afternoon, his old bicycle was carefully locked to the fence outside, and he would be there in the common room. He brought not only music but also a different world for Liam to temporarily escape his harsh reality. He brought homemade ginger cookies, a bit misshapen but fragrant with cinnamon and love. He told Liam about the behind-the-scenes stories of great composers. "Did you know, Liam," he would say, "that Bach had 20 children? I wonder how he managed to compose with a chorus of kids screaming in the house." A clear, rare laugh escaped Liam's lips. In those moments, Liam was no longer a dying patient. He was a curious student, his eyes lighting up whenever he learned a new chord, his lips moving along with his teacher's stories. And Daniel, he was not just a volunteer. He was able to live out his most beloved role again, a teacher, a nurturer of spirits. One Thursday afternoon, as Daniel was waiting for Liam in the hallway, he overheard a conversation between two nurses pushing a supply cart. "Poor kid in room 702, one young nurse said sympathetically. "The latest test results show his bone marrow is almost completely gone. Only a bone marrow transplant can save him, but blood type is as rare as gold. We couldn't find a match in the national database." The words hit Daniel like a lightning bolt. ORH. That blood type was like a rusty key, opening a dusty, painful room of memories in his mind. He sat on the plastic chair, paralyzed, the noise around him seemingly fading away, leaving only a buzzing in his ears. He remembered the long, sleepless nights in this very hospital 15 years ago. He remembered his wife's pale face and his daughter's eyes filled with despair. Anna. That evening, Daniel returned to his small two-room apartment in an old building. The furniture was simple but neatly arranged. He didn't turn on the lights, just sat in the darkness, allowing the memories he had tried to bury for so many years to resurface. He rummaged through an old wooden cabinet where he kept important keepsakes. His hands trembled as he pulled out a rusty tin box. Inside were a few photos, a soft brown lock of hair tied with a pink ribbon, and an old medical record book. He turned on the desk lamp, and the faint yellow light fell upon the words written in faded blue ink. Patient's name, Anna Peterson. Blood type, ORH. Was it a cruel coincidence, or a sign of fate? The next day, he went to a private testing center in a different district, far from St. Jude Hospital. He fabricated a story about his brother needing a compatibility test for a kidney donation. He used his meager savings to pay for the expensive HLA test. The waiting days were torture. He was filled with burning hope and extreme fear. What if he was a match? He was almost 60, and his heart wasn't as strong as it used to be. A doctor had already warned him about a mild heart valve regurgitation, advising him to avoid all stress and strenuous activity. A bone marrow extraction would be a huge burden on his aging body, but if he wasn't a match, Liam's last hope would also fade away. He would have to stand by, helpless, just as he had before. The results arrived in an unmarked white envelope. He sat in the kitchen, taking a long time to muster the courage to tear it open. A series of complex medical terms appeared, but at the bottom of the page was a conclusion, bold and clear, unmistakable. Compatibility, 10/10. Perfect match. He could save Liam. A burst of joy, so intense it choked him. But immediately afterward, the fear of personal risk washed over him. He sat on the old wooden chair, struggling with himself. On one side was a child's life, on the other was the rest of his own. But then, the image of Anna came back, her eyes looking at him with complete trust. He remembered his hopeless promise to her. "I will do everything to make you well, Anna." He had failed once. He couldn't fail a second time. The next morning, with a steely resolve, he brought the results to the hospital and met with Dr. Miller. The head physician examined the results, his face unable to hide his extreme surprise. "This is unbelievable, Mr. Peterson. This is a coincidence that's almost a miracle. I have never seen a case like this in my 30 years of practice." But then, the astonishment on his face was quickly replaced by concern. "But we are very sorry. The law does not permit bone marrow donations from non-relatives, except in special cases that have been pre-registered. The legal risk is too great. If any complications were to occur with you, we could be sued into bankruptcy. But this is the boy's only chance," Daniel pleaded, his voice urgent. "The law was created to protect people, not to tie down humanity." "I understand, sir," Dr. Miller said, his voice full of sympathy but firm. "But rules are rules. We cannot risk our medical license and the reputation of the entire hospital. I am truly sorry." Daniel left, feeling as if he had been pushed from heaven to hell. He wandered the streets, not knowing where he was going. He saw children playing in the park, their laughter like knives cutting into his heart. Why should a child's chance to live be taken away by some meaningless regulations? That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by his old piano, his fingers gliding over the keys without making a sound. He remembered the moment Anna took her last breath. She had passed away in silence, but the silent scream of helplessness still echoed in his soul to this day. He would not let that scream haunt him again. The next morning, Daniel returned to the hospital. This time, he was not alone. He was accompanied by an old lawyer, a friend. He didn't argue or plead. He simply placed a thick folder on the medical board's meeting table. Inside was a meticulously drafted legal waiver that fully released the hospital and the Thorne family from all legal liability, stating that he was acting completely voluntarily and was aware of all the risks. Alongside it was his own cardiac medical record, with the doctor's warnings circled. He stood before the board, a group of learned and powerful doctors, his voice not loud but clear and resolute. "I know the risks," he said, looking straight into Dr. Miller's eyes. "I know my heart has a problem, but I also know what it feels like to lose a child when hope is right there in front of you. I lost my daughter once. I will not let that happen again." And he placed a photo of Anna on top of the folder. Her radiant smile seemed to light up the tense meeting room. The medical board was silent. They looked at the man before them, at the eyes that held an indelible pain and an unshakable determination. They saw not just an old teacher, but a father trying to rewrite history, trying to save a child to soothe the soul of another. Finally, after a long silence, Dr. Miller picked up his pen and signed the consent form. An agreement was given in silence, in the face of one man's immense sacrifice and overwhelming grief. The day of the surgery arrived on a Tuesday morning, bright and sunny, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that enveloped the St. Jude surgical wing. Daniel hadn't told Liam the truth. The boy was only informed that the hospital had found an anonymous bone marrow donor in another city. For a child, the truth about his teacher's sacrifice could be too heavy a psychological burden. Before the nurses wheeled him into the prep room, Daniel handed Nurse Mary a cream-colored envelope, giving her specific instructions. "Mary, please give this to Liam when he wakes up and is well enough to read it. Only then, please." "Yes, Mr. Daniel. You have my word," Mary replied, her eyes red-rimmed. She was one of the few who knew the entire story. Inside the envelope was a short piece of music he had carefully handwritten on ruled paper. It had no title, just simple notes containing a gentle, hopeful melody. Along with it was a neatly written note. "Liam, this is my final gift to you. Play it with all your heart. If I don't wake up, remember that your first complete piece of music is the gift I've waited my whole life for." David only learned the truth an hour into the surgery. Dr. Miller had called him into his office. He walked in impatiently, thinking it was a routine update. But when the head physician showed him a copy of the legal waiver Daniel had signed, along with his cardiac medical records, David's world was turned upside down. "The donor is him," David stammered, unable to believe his ears. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. Mr. Peterson was adamant about this. He said he couldn't let history repeat itself," Dr. Miller explained, his voice full of respect. David was stunned. The man he had disdained, the one he considered a poor, common man, was now on an operating table, risking his fragile life for David's son. A mix of shame, regret, and sudden gratitude swelled and churned in his chest. He rushed out of the office and ran to the surgical wing. The hallway was cold, with only the hum of machinery and the distinctive smell of antiseptic. He looked through the two glass windows of the two operating rooms facing each other. On one side, his son was being carefully transfused with every drop of precious bone marrow, the lifeblood of new life. On the other side, Daniel lay there, pale and weak under the glaring surgical lights. The proud man's heart shattered. He sank onto a cold metal bench, burying his face in his hands. He, David Thorne, who could move mountains in the business world, was now completely helpless. For the first time in his life, he prayed, not with money, not with power, but with the hot tears of remorse. The surgery lasted 8 hours. Daniel's bone marrow was successfully transferred to Liam, and initial tests showed no signs of rejection. It was good news, but just as the medical team in Liam's operating room breathed a sigh of relief, disaster struck in the room next door. Daniel's already weak heart, after enduring hours of surgical stress, could not bear the burden. The heart monitor suddenly let out a continuous series of beeps, then a single, deafeningly straight line. "Cardiac arrest, get the defibrillator." The red emergency light above the door flashed. Doctors rushed in. David jumped up, pressing his face against the cold glass. He watched the chaotic scene, Daniel's chest bouncing with each electric shock, but the straight line on the screen didn't change. He screamed in vain, but his cry was muffled by the thick glass. A few days later, Liam woke up in the recovery room. He felt different. The aches in his bones had subsided, and he could breathe more deeply. Nurse Mary was by his side, smiling at him. "Hello, champion. You did great." When he was fully alert, Mary gave him his teacher's letter. Liam's hands trembled as he opened it, reading the words his teacher had written and looking at the musical score. Tears silently fell, wetting the page. He understood everything. The anonymous donor was his teacher. He asked the nurse to place the electronic piano on the table beside his bed. With his remaining strength, he sat up, his fingers still weak but full of determination as he placed them on the keys. He played the piece his teacher had written. The clear, hopeful melody filled the silent room, then spread throughout the hospital hallway. David, who had been keeping vigil outside for days, heard the music. He rushed to the door of his son's room. He saw Liam playing the piano, his face tear-streaked, but his eyes shining with a new vitality. He stood there, leaning against the wall, and cried like a child. The music of life, bought with sacrifice, had completely melted his stony heart. In the intensive care unit a few hallways away, Daniel was still in a coma. He had been revived after the cardiac arrest, but his brain had been briefly deprived of oxygen, leaving him in a deep coma. Doctors weren't sure if he would ever wake up. He was adrift in a boundless void, where the pain of Anna's death and the weariness of life were dragging him down into eternal darkness. But then, a sound infiltrated his unconsciousness, a familiar, gentle melody. Liam's piano music. A nurse, moved by the story, had turned on the internal speaker system in the recovery area so the boy's music could be heard. That sound was like an invisible thread, a ray of light piercing the thick darkness, holding him back. It whispered to him that his sacrifice had not been in vain, that a new life was taking root. His heart monitor, which had been beating weakly and steadily, flickered. His hand, which had been limp on the bed, trembled, his fingers curling, gently clenching the sheet. He heard it. The music had brought him back from the brink of death. Time has a magical power. It can heal physical wounds, soothe emotional pain, and build unexpected relationships. A year passed since the day of the fated surgery. Jude Hospital was now just a memory, a closed chapter in the lives of 3 people. Liam had made a full recovery. The miracle of medicine, combined with the power of love, had transformed the pale, weak boy into a healthy, cheerful 1-year-old. His new bone marrow worked perfectly, regenerating life within his body. His wavy chestnut hair had grown back, and his cheeks now had the rosy glow of an active child. He went back to school, made friends, and even joined the school basketball team. But one thing never changed: his love for the piano. It was no longer a pastime but a part of his soul, an eternal connection to the man who gave him a second chance at life. Daniel also survived. He woke up from his coma after 2 weeks, but the surgery and cardiac arrest had left irreversible complications. His health had significantly weakened. He needed a cane to walk, and fatigue came over him frequently. He had to retire early, leaving the podium and his beloved students behind. But there was no sadness in his eyes, only a deep sense of peace and contentment. Every time he saw Liam smile, every time he heard his music, he knew his sacrifice had been completely worth it. The person who changed the most was perhaps David. He had sold a large portion of his shares in his business empire, handing over daily operations to his vice presidents. He realized he had spent his entire life building a golden castle, but had nearly let his only treasure perish inside it. Now, he spent most of his time with his new family, Liam and Daniel. He was no longer a distant CEO, but a true father. He learned to cook simple meals, helped Liam with his homework, and every weekend, he drove them both to a small house by a lake he had bought, where they could fish and enjoy the quiet. He also covered all of Daniel's medical and living expenses, not as charity, but as devoted care for a family member. One afternoon, David returned to the headquarters of Thorne Incorporated. He went straight to the executive boardroom on the top floor, where he had once uttered his contempt for Daniel. He stood for a moment, reminiscing about that shameful moment. Then, he called the head of human resources and gave an order. A few weeks later, the luxurious boardroom was renovated. The expensive leather chairs were replaced with comfortable armchairs. The glass wall was adorned with stylized musical notes. In the middle of the room was a grand piano. Engraved on the door was a solemn inscription: "The Anna Peterson Music Room, a silent apology and a permanent tribute." Liam's elementary school graduation took place on a sunny June afternoon. The school auditorium was packed with parents and students. In the talent show, Liam's piano solo was the most anticipated performance. The boy walked onto the stage in a neat uniform, confidently bowing to the audience. He sat at the grand piano, took a deep breath. The stage lights shone on him, but his eyes were focused on one single spot in the audience. Below, Daniel was seated. He looked frail in an old suit, but his eyes sparkled with pride and happiness. David sat beside him, gently placing a thin blanket over his shoulders when a slight draft from the air conditioner blew by. Liam began to play. It was the very song Daniel had written for him. Now, he had developed it into a full composition, titled Teacher's Melody. The tune was at times lyrical and somber, like the desperate days in the hospital, then gradually grew strong and soaring, like the joy of rebirth, and ended with a resounding, optimistic chord. The entire auditorium was hushed, captivated by the story told through music. When the last note rang out and faded into the air, the silence erupted into a continuous, thunderous applause. Everyone stood up, applauding the boy's talent. After the ceremony, as people were filing out, a young reporter from the local newspaper, who had heard about Liam's miraculous story, approached David. "Mr. Thorne, what an inspiring story. How do you feel about the hero who saved your son's life?" At that moment, another parent, who had been filming the entire performance, and the moment Liam looked down at the audience, was also recording this interview. David smiled, a sincere and peaceful smile, with no trace of his old arrogance. He looked towards Daniel, who Liam had run to and was now hugging tightly, his small head resting on his teacher's shoulder. "He's not a hero," David said, his voice warm and emotional. "He's family." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued, an admission from the depths of his healed heart. "I used to think I could buy the world. But he taught me that the most precious things in life aren't the things you can buy, but the things you are willing to give away. And a true father isn't necessarily by blood." Liam heard the words. He let go of his teacher, ran, and took both David's and Daniel's hands. He stood between the two men, holding their hands tightly. The three of them stood together in the crowded lobby, forming a complete, inseparable family portrait. That evening, the video of the performance, the reunion, and David's interview was posted on social media. It quickly became a sensation. Millions of views, comments, and shares worldwide. Hashtags like #TeachersMelody and #TrueFather trended globally. Their story was no longer just their own. It had become a flame of inspiration for millions. A few months later, the National Symphony Orchestra contacted them. They proposed arranging Teacher's Melody into a symphony and performing it at a major charity concert. All proceeds would be donated to the Anna Peterson Bone Marrow Donation Fund that David had just established. The final scene of the film, the city's Grand Theatre. The stage lights were brilliant. The entire orchestra was playing the final notes of Teacher's Melody, majestic and full of hope. In the audience, Liam, David, and Daniel sat side by side, holding hands. They weren't looking at the stage, but at each other, their eyes filled with happiness. The song was no longer just theirs. It had become a symbol of hope for everyone. An immortal melody, a symphony of sacrifice and rebirth that would echo forever.